right, so it's good to be here. Today, we're going to be talking about, uh, like, like we just heard, we're going to talk about the Platypus finance case study, and then afterwards, I'm going to talk about some best practices for recovering from an exploiter attack that you can use for the projects that you're working on or working with. And then afterwards, we'll have some time for Q&A. So just a little bit about me. My academic background is in math and statistics. I've been in DeFi since 2019. Primarily, I was doing risk and governance at first, but since late 2021, I've been working a lot on threat detection and on-chain sleuthing, as you can see on my Twitter. So let's get started by talking about this Platypus Finance case study. So Platypus Finance is a stable swap or curve fork on Avalanche. It started in late 2021. And in February 2023, they launched this new stablecoin called USP. And I think it's sort of designed similarly to how Curve USD is supposed to work at some point. Basically, it's backed by the stable assets in the stable swap pool. And by the day before the attack, the total supply of USP was up to 3.25 million. So on the day of the attack, which is February 16th, 2023, the attacker started off by funding his wallet using fixed float. After the Tornado Cash sanctions, we often see attackers using different funding sources like fixed float or change now, or sometimes different multi-chain or cross-chain bridges. So anyways, this guy funded using fixed float, and actually he's going to fund several times using fixed float, which ultimately leads to his downfall. So about 25 minutes later, after funding his wallet, he deploys his first attack contract and calls the attack function, which he calls hello. But unfortunately, the attack worked, and it drained about 8 million in stablecoins from the protocol. But actually, due to an error in the attack contract, he never implemented any withdrawal function. So all the stablecoins were just stuck in the contract forever, or so we thought, at least. So after that, about 15 minutes later, he's like, oh, darn it, I can't withdraw any of the money I stole, so I guess we better try again. So he deploys a second attack contract and again calls the hello function about 5 minutes afterward. But this time, he had a different error in the contract, and the proceeds got sent to Aave reserves rather than to him. So yeah, he's got to try again. So about 10 minutes or 15 minutes after that, he deploys a third attack contract, and this time it finally works. And he's able to escape with about 250K, 14,000 AVAX. So about 40 minutes after this third attack was when I first heard about it. I'm not sure. There might have been some chatter about it before that. I don't specifically focus on AVAX, so I was a little bit slow on this one. But it sort of becomes public knowledge about 40 minutes afterward. Now, in the aftermath after that, you can see there's about an hour delay. We see that Tether actually freezes the USDT that's trapped in the first attack contract. Ultimately, this doesn't really do anything because the attack contract was bugged, but it's still good. Like, just in case he found some way to get it out, it's good that it got frozen. And then about 7 or 8 hours after that, the attacker was actually identified and publicly called out on Twitter by our friend Zach XBT. Shout out to him. And about 12 hours after that, the Platypus team was able to upgrade their proxy, and with the help of BlockSec, they actually recovered the USDC that was taken and locked in the contract. And then about a week after that, the attacker was arrested in France. So this was an unusually good outcome, I would say, for a DeFi hack. We usually don't get funds recovered. We usually don't get the attacker arrested. So things went well. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into some of the technical aspects of this. So first of all, what was the root cause of this? And let me just note that I'm not a Solidity dev, so please forgive me if I make any mistakes in talking about this, but I did think that it was good context to share. So as reported by Daniel VF on Twitter, the root cause of this attack was that this solvency check was actually before the funds are withdrawn and before the user's balance is updated. So obviously it's not going to properly account for the withdrawal. So basically the user can take out a bunch of debt, withdraw all their collateral, and repeat. So that's a problem. We don't want to do that. So next, you might be curious, how was the attacker identified? And like I alluded to before, one of the big problems for him was that he actually had 3 separate funding transactions from fixed float. And obviously that's going to significantly reduce your anonymity because you have three different suspiciously sized transactions that can be matched to where the deposit came from. And actually, in this case, he used an address that previously interacted with a KYC account as well as his ENS. So, yeah, he screwed up here and he was able to be identified and ultimately arrested by French police. So you also might be interested in, okay, well, how did the 2.3 million USDC get recovered from his original attack contract? And here again, hat tip to Daniel VF on Twitter. But essentially what was done was the proxy contract for Platypus Finance was upgraded, and using a fake flash loan callback, because the attacker had approved the pool contract to spend the funds, it just was a matter of upgrading the contract to say, give me all your money. So as you can see here, this is the decompile of the upgraded proxy contract. And basically what it does is it just calls transfer from on the USDC contract, transfer from attacker contract to us. So yeah, the attacker was very sloppy with this contract and he paid the price. So a couple of takeaways from this case study. First of all, you need to be careful with these functions like emergency withdraw that aren't intended to be called often, because a lot of times it's not going to be tested as well, and stuff like this can slip through where the solvency check is in the wrong place. And secondly, don't hesitate to reach out for help from the public and from the security community after experiencing an exploit. Obviously, lots of people played a role in this and getting as good an outcome as happened. And thirdly, hope whoever attacks you makes as many mistakes as this guy did. So after talking about that, we're going to discuss some best practices, I think, for projects you're auditing or working with or developing yourself. So we'll talk about 3 different parts: before the attack occurs, while the attack is underway, and after the attack is confirmed. So before an attack occurs, one very useful thing is to have a robust internal notification system for things that happen that could be relevant, could be an attack going on. So just a couple of examples, large TVL changes. If the TVL is going down, it might mean someone stole all the money. If the TVL is going up, it might mean that, somebody's depositing a lot of bad collateral and is about to withdraw all the money. So that's certainly something that, you might want to have it ping somebody on the dev team or somebody involved in the project to take a look and make sure nothing suspicious is going on. Also, multi-sig transactions, especially if there's a time lock, you might be interested in case Lazarus or some other threat actor has compromised your multi-sig, or some of the signers. You want to find out, like, oh, the multi-sig is doing a transaction and we don't know about it. We don't know what this is. That's something that is useful to know. And also new governance votes. If your project has on-chain governance, we've seen several types of governance attacks where someone will just basically make their own votes and say, give me all the money in your treasury. And, if you're used to governance votes only happening when you propose them, you might not notice. And that will potentially give the attacker, they will need less governance tokens in order to pass their malicious vote. So obviously, depending on your project, there might be other things you're interested in, notifications wise, but the important thing is you should have some notifications that help you, because minutes and seconds even sometimes matter when it comes to these attacks. And so ideally, you should be the first one to know. You shouldn't have to rely on random sleuths on Twitter or in your DMs telling you that something happened to your project. You should be the first one to know. So secondly, I highly recommend you verify all your contracts on Etherscan. Sometimes projects will say that, like, oh, it's going to make it harder for the attackers if our contracts are unverified. But really, for a motivated attacker, it's not going to be an issue. But if somebody's trying to research, like, what's going on with your project, if all of your contracts are unverified and we can't figure out what's going on, then it's going to be a lot more challenging. And secondly, it's really best practices to have your project name and to have contact info in all of your contracts that are verified. This is really helpful because, if you see a contract that's under attack, you are going to want to contact whoever wrote it, whoever's in charge of maintaining it. But if it's just some random contract with no info, it's going to take a couple minutes, sometimes longer, to figure out, like, who it is, where to go to find them. And that sort of thing is what really slows down a response. So another thing that's important is you really want to have time zone coverage for whenever the attack takes place. A lot of times, attackers will specifically try to attack a project when the devs are asleep, when it's not their time zone, when they're at a conference, stuff like that. And so it's really important to have, some way to get notified, to find out that something is going on and that you need to respond. So one thing that can be useful is to have somebody on call, or potentially to have community mods that, like, have your phone number and can call you if stuff is happening. Another useful thing is to have circuit breakers, emergency DAOs, or similar to that, to allow for a rapid action to take place to stop an attack potentially. Obviously, you don't want to necessarily have governance that can just rug all the money and run away right away. That's not helpful. But if you have something that can pause the system, that can, stop trading, stop lending for a while, that can be very useful. Just, it's good to have it be limited to stuff that strictly reduces risk and that isn't going to lead to your users getting rugged by the multi-sig. Okay, so now we're going to move on to what to do when an attack is underway, when it's, somebody DMs you with a suspicious transaction or a suspicious user. So the first thing is, typically, you're going to find out about an attack, at least if you don't have a really robust notification system. People are going to be talking about the attack in your chat channels. They'll be messaging your mods or your devs. And so it's important to sort of have an idea of what to look for, what is really suspicious, what really needs to be escalated immediately, and what potentially is benign. So a few things to look for. First of all, where the user got their funding and what sort of history they have on the wallet. Typically, if it's like a fresh account and it's funded by, these suspicious funding sources, like, for example, Tornado or Change Now or Fixed Float, or potentially from a cross-chain bridge that like originally came from Tornado, those are much more likely to be malicious in some way or another than an old account that has thousands of transactions and a bunch of transactions with a centralized exchange. Like typically an attacker is not going to use a wallet like that. Although, obviously there are exceptions. Like, for example, the Nomad attacker, the first one, actually was like some guy's ENS that had a bunch of CEX history, and I'm not really sure what happened there, honestly. So secondly, if the suspicious user has deployed a contract, you want to look at that contract and sort of see what's going on, see if it looks suspicious or looks like an attack could be underway. So one useful thing is to look at the bytecode and the call data to see if it's mentioning any of your contracts, because that's typically how you'll find out, like, oh, this suspicious user is actually attacking us. They're not attacking somebody else. Secondly, you want to look at, are they using flash loans? Because oftentimes an attacker will use a flash loan. It is usually a higher likelihood if a contract is using a flash loan that it's somehow malicious. Third, how complex is the contract? Typically, an attack is going to be more complex than something like an MEV bot or a scam token or whatever other kind of thing that could be going on. Obviously, that's not a hard and fast rule. Some attack contracts are very simple, but if it's really, really long and lots of stuff is going on, it's generally a red flag. So a couple of green flags. If you see in the decompile or in the bytecode a reference to BlockTech Coinbase, it's oftentimes going to be an MEV bot. They use that to sort of organize bribes and stuff like that. So that tends to be more benign than contracts that don't reference it. Also, if you look at the EOA, if it's one of those like 0x0000, oftentimes it's more likely to be MEV. Of course, sometimes MEV and exploiters have some crossover, so you can't totally rule out an attacker, but it's generally a good sign that it's more likely to be benign. So if they've actually deployed the contract and done one or more suspicious transactions, obviously you want to look at those transactions and see, okay, what's going on? Did they steal all our money? Etc. So a useful tool is openchain.xyz. Formerly, it was tx.samc's son, but it's very useful because it will sort of decode the transactions. It'll show you this nice value changes page, which here we see in this picture what the Platypus Finance exploit looked like. And as you can see, it's not a good sign when like your contracts are showing minus 1.2 million, minus 1.5 million, and the attacker's contract is showing plus 40 million. That's often a sign that something has gone wrong. Secondly, you might be suspicious if the transactions show a pattern of uneconomic activity, especially when it's routed through their user-created contract. So oftentimes you'll see stuff like 0.1 USDC getting deposited to a bridge via a user contract. And, typically real users are not going to be depositing 0.1 USDC. So oftentimes that's a sign of somebody trying an attack or at least testing a potential exploit in production. So now we'll talk about what to do after an attack is confirmed. So the first thing I think that sort of common sense, but creating a war room with people that can help you, devs, auditors, security researchers. Obviously, it's going to help to have everybody in one place and not to be chasing people around in DMs. So as an auditor, this might be when you get called in to a project that you previously audited. Generally speaking, the first thing you want to do is limit future damage. So pause contracts, stop new trading, stop lending, etc. Obviously, it's going to depend how much governance power your project has. But that's generally a good first step, is to make sure that nothing else is going to go wrong. I also think that in general, it makes sense to make a public statement as quickly as possible, giving any important action items for the public. So, if your governance token was infinite minted, you might want to tell them not to buy it. If any deposits are going to get stolen, you might want to tell them not to deposit, that sort of thing. That's definitely in the public's interest. And also, just like anecdotally, I think it's helpful for marshaling all the resources of the community to help you out, to stop the attacker from laundering the money, to potentially catch them, etc. So reaching out to the attacker, offering a bounty, sometimes it works. It might be working for this Euler attacker. I'm not sure. But, it doesn't cost you anything, so you may as well give it a shot. Also, it makes sense to contact third parties that might be able to make it more difficult for them to launder the money. After you do that, it definitely makes sense to do root cause analysis on how the exploit was done. I do think that sometimes, we have a tendency to want to jump immediately to root cause, but I think it's potentially a little bit less urgent than some of the other actions on this list. Obviously, if the money's all gone, then to a certain extent, it doesn't matter that much immediately why it happened. But of course, you want to do it at some point once the other more urgent action items happen. So you might be interested in, are any of your other products or contracts vulnerable to a similar exploit? Are any other projects on the market vulnerable? And secondly, if the attacker still has some of your project tokens, whether it's governance tokens or like LP tokens or whatever, you might be interested in, does it make sense to just totally start over, do a snapshot, and reissue the token? If you have governance powers, you might be able to just do it more cleanly and like specifically rug just the attacker. But that's something that's going to have to be decided on a project by project basis. All right, so I think that's all I had. I'm happy to take any questions. So this one actually, I just heard from a friend. Typically speaking, I get alerts or notifications of certain kinds of suspicious activity, but like I was saying, with Avalanche in particular, I don't spend a lot of time on that. So I actually didn't get a notification for this specific one. I think I saw it maybe in one of the Telegram channels, like Lobster DAO or similar. So typically, a lot of what I look for is deployed contracts, just because the vast majority of attackers are going to deploy a contract at some point. And so I find that that's like the most fruitful place to look for suspicious activity. And I guess also, like, potentially, if you catch it right after the contract is deployed and it takes a while for them to figure out or to submit the actual attack transaction, sometimes you can alert the project devs in time and stop the attack. So that's definitely happened a few times, and that's always satisfying when that happens. Well, I think we'll probably see more of I forget which project it was that got attacked, and like somebody completely generalized front ran the entire attack. I think you'll see more of that happening. I think you'll also see attackers get much more vigilant about not leaving a ton of time to respond in between them sort of leaking their plans on chain and actually rugging the protocol. That's something that is like clearly not optimal on the attacker's part. And so, unfortunately, it's sort of a game that I think is going to be hard to win for the white hats in the long run. But that doesn't mean that we can't. It doesn't mean that we can't do some good now while attackers are still being very sloppy. I'm also sort of interested in if anyone will develop a white hat system that is good at generalized front running this kind of thing. I think a lot of people are capable of doing that, but the legal concerns are obviously getting in the way sometimes. So I understand that. Uh, well, I think it's good to get good using Etherscan, obviously. It's sort of a lazy answer, I guess. But Etherscan is still like definitely the tool that I use the most, and I think most on-chain sleuths use the most. Obviously, different APIs, different more advanced tooling like OpenChain or Oko.Palkio or Tenderly or whatever. Those are useful too at times. I think that getting used to sort of the intricacies and the peculiarities of the different on-chain block explorers and APIs, and sort of understanding which which kind of things are suspicious and which kind of things are normal for MEV or just people transacting on chain. That's also helpful. You sort of develop a sense for just looking at a transaction on Etherscan or on one of the other block explorers, whether something interesting or weird is going on, or whether it's just business as usual. And I think that's really a competitive advantage in terms of on-chain sleuthing. Yeah, so basically what happened was the attacker's contract was calling specific functions in the Platypus pool contract, which was a proxy that was upgradable. And so, in particular, it was giving approval to that contract to spend its USDC as part of the attack. And so, what happened was the team just upgraded the pool contract in question and had it basically just say, attacker, give me all your money. You've already approved it. So there wasn't anything to stop the attack contract from sending away all the money. I believe that's accurate. Feel free to correct me if I'm off base on that. Yeah, that sounds right. Um, I think potentially the USDT got frozen, so probably they can reissue that and recover that. But I don't know what the status of that is exactly. Um, but I think that most of the funds will eventually be recovered. So hopefully there shouldn't be too much of a loss for the Platypus finance team. Yeah, thanks for having me.